Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Buck Stops Here. I am Catherine Murray, and today we have a special guest. Stephen Myrow is joining us. He's a managing director at Beacon Policy Advisors, which is a Washington, D.C. research firm. And Stephen, it's great to have you here today. It's just pretty incredible with investors still focused so much on significant issues in the Strait of Hormuz, upcoming trade and tariff negotiations, as well as the upcoming China-U.S. summit. A lot to break down. Why don't we first start with the very latest on what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz, and is there an off ramp, and what does that look like?
Absolutely, Catherine. The issue here is President Trump is faced with two not so appetizing options. One is to forcibly reopen the strait. It would take a significant escalation of a military operation and the related market fallout that you would see from that. And his actions and most of his rhetoric to date have demonstrated that he's not interested in that. The problem is the only other option is to leave with a deal that that most people would seem as not very appetizing because it effectively the Iranians are going to want to maintain control of the strait. And we think the only real deal at this point is a narrow one that you get a reopening of the strait, but probably one in which the Iranians keep a tolling mechanism in place. And at the same time, the US lifts its blockade. As long as the markets are focused elsewhere right now, like AI and earnings, it doesn't put a lot of pressure on the president to move quickly, but there are economic pressures building in the background and political ones. So he's looking for that out, but at some point, we believe he's going to be willing to take that less than appetizing deal.
So, where does that leave the situation as it relates to one of the original threats, of course, which was nuclear armament?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see any meaningful change there. The problem with this conflict now that the US and the rest of the world is left with is the whole concern was Iran having this nuclear deterrent. They have found a cheaper and much more effective deterrent, which is control of the Strait of Hormuz. And
Hmm.
unless we were physically, militarily willing to seize that, they're not going to let that go.
So just to be really clear, you see it as just a bit of a pullback and they're going to control the Strait of Hormuz? If that's the case, what does that mean for energy prices going forward? To me, it would seem it's going to be elevated for about 20% of the global supply.
Well, I think in the near term, that's right. I think it will drop to some degree from where we are now because you get the transit resuming. My sense, Catherine, is look, we can talk about the negative, the multiple adverse geopolitical implications, but if you're talking purely from a market perspective, I think the market just wants the transit to resume. And if they have to add a dollar amount into their models to what it
Mm.
costs for energy and other commodities to go through the strait, they'd be happy to just be able to get back to those models. Now, over the longer time, and it will take a long time, I think you will see what happens naturally with supply and demand. There would be, attempts to find alternative routes for, you build more pipelines, things of that nature. And I think the Gulf states are going to want to play it out to see, if they can get reestablish some balance where they can pressure Iran maybe through other means to give up the tolling. But I think people just want to get back to things moving through the strait first.
Hmm. And it seems though they are already finding other routes, which is quite interesting. Or maybe they're using routes that might not be the first choice. Real quick before we head to break, you do cover institutional clients around the world. Do they share that same sentiment that you just mentioned, that like, let's just get back to understanding what the rules of the game are and I can model it out?
It's interesting. I can't really tell. A lot of times it's one way, us telling them. They're not necessarily sharing their view back at us. I think they just struggle a lot with where this is. And I think from their perspective, they're just trying to figure out how we can move forward.
Got it. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. So, Stephen, as we talked about institutional investors, and I was, of course, on the institutional trading desk, they do move markets. Their opinions matter. They're dealing with the Strait of Hormuz, as we all are. Another item, of course, though, that's front and center are trade and tariff negotiations. Uh, we've heard President Trump raise tariffs on European autos. We have, and I want to focus on this, in Canada, USMCA coming up. But I don't feel like we've heard much. What is the whisper?
Sure. So I think where the difference was with the investors and where our take had been, at least coming into the year or with the Supreme Court case pending, is people assumed that this would give the investors consensus, assumed that this would give the Trump administration an excuse to take the tariffs off. When we had to explain to them, no, the last thing you do with President Trump is tell him he can't do something that he cares about. He's going to come back and hit harder to show you that he can. He has many mechanisms beyond the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and he's showing that. So I think we're going to get back to pretty much status quo in terms of the reciprocal tariffs. With the reference to the European ones, I'm not convinced the other ones will go into effect. I think the president is frustrated with how slow the Europeans have been moving in ratifying the agreement that was struck. So I think that this is a pressure tactic, at least for the time being. We'll see where he goes. And then in terms of the one that you guys really care about, the USMCA, or as you call it, the US or the CUSMA,
Right.
it's all about perspective. The really interesting thing here, Catherine, is you roll this back to when we started that agreement, and it was all about Canada and the U.S. working together because they had the better relationship, and U.S. had most of the problems with Mexico. Not to say that there aren't, longstanding, whether it's dairy or softwood lumber or other trade issues between U.S. and Canada, but for the most part, U.S. and Canada were tight, and it was wrestling with Mexico. We've seen a complete flip now with the way the Trump administration is looking at this. They see it as Trump and Sheinbaum have the better relationship. And even though it's a multilateral agreement, he prefers bilateral negotiation. So why you're not hearing much in Canada is because the Trump administration is focused right now on working with Mexico. They want to get a deal with Mexico, and then they want to rope in the Canadians afterwards. So it's really kind of amazing when you think about how things have changed over not that many years.
Well, and it seems as though part of the change, the catalyst was Prime Minister Carney pivoting towards China. What's the read on that move in DC?
It depends who you ask. I think maybe the Trump administration would agree with you. Personally, if I'm trying to call it objectively, I would say that because of the way the Trump administration came out of the box with Canada, that the Canadian government felt that it had to balance itself somewhat. I'm not endorsing any of these views. I'm just trying to call it objectively. I think you hear the reference, which I believe Prime Minister Carney first used with the reference to the middle powers when he gave this speech in Europe, and that it's this view that everyone outside of U.S. and China now is feeling like they're between a rock and a hard place. And they're trying to play both sides, and they're trying to figure out where they fit in this.
Hmm. I guess though, when you actually look at the details for USMCA or CUSMA, do you expect much change? Do you expect there to be more pressure on the Canadian economy via tariffs?
Well, I think, first of all, you obviously already have more tariffs from the reciprocal tariffs, but I would say I think there's going to be uncertainty because you're going to have repeated threats from the Trump administration to pull out just to try to, follow their typical maximal leverage position. I think in the end, what you're going to wind up with is an agreement that's effectively renegotiated every year. And
Mm,
better than having no agreement, but I'm not sure, it's that uncertainty that doesn't help. And particularly in the auto sector, you're going to
right.
see, I think, a push for some changes.
Stephen, we just briefly mentioned Canada pivoting to China. I'm curious what the US China relationship really is right now and what President Trump wants it to be.
Kind of the interesting thing about this, Catherine, maybe like the one thing I misjudged the most when the Trump administration came back in is really saw them going more aggressive on China, in part because of the more hawks that surrounded the president. I think what's interesting is relative to some of these other relationships in the world right now, that are rocky with traditional allies. Uh, we have a relative stability, at least on the surface, with China right now. It started the way that I thought it would, but I think part of it is President Trump personally is so focused on the trade side, but what
Hmm.
really is, the version of the Strait of Hormuz in the U.S. China relationship, it's not trade, it's the access to technology and inputs to technology, so export controls. So you can threaten tariffs all you want, but the real power is, the access to advanced U.S. technology and the U.S. receiving the Chinese critical minerals that are needed as the inputs. And so you see this split inside the Trump administration that's fascinating. That I didn't necessarily anticipate, and I think it's the influx of the Silicon Valley component, which is people like
Hmm.
David Sachs, who served as his AI and crypto advisor. They have a view that you want to spread the technology far and wide, and the way you assert leverage is you get the Chinese hooked on the U.S. stack. Meanwhile, the traditional hawks, and you still see many of these in the Republican Party on the Hill, in Congress, they believe the way do best in negotiating with China is you limit access to U.S. technology and you force them to try to develop it on their own. And so
Right.
between the tensions, I would say that Sachs' view seems to be winning out right now. And since Trump cares more about trade than technology, you see kind of a willingness on his part to trade away on the technology side to try to get something on the trade side. Having said that, I think the grand deal he's looking for is going to be too hard for them to actually get, but it's not going to stop him from trying. And even though this first summit's delayed, the plan is for him and Xi to meet, in person up to four times this year. So it's
Hmm.
something to watch.
So, what would the grand deal be, though? Access to critical minerals and what?
I think what from Trump perspective, it would be, large promises again on the trade front to buy lots of exports from the US. Number one. Number two, and export controls or limit export controls so US has more access. And three, on the technology side, I think he'd be willing to provide more than the Hawks certainly would want them to.
Mhm.
I think from the Chinese side, one thing they're really looking for is some flexibility on Taiwan. And I think there's a lot of, concern on both sides of the aisle in Congress that, they don't want the president to go there.
Hmm. It's interesting just on the tech front. I read many different strategists and research pieces, what have you. And even if you look at China's development of AI, I've also, well, I've read that they've developed their own chips, right? So how dependent are they on David Sacks's view that have them buy from us? I mean, I would have to imagine that they're not going to go down that path to such a significant degree.
Well, it's also interesting because every time Trump gives in on, like, whether it's the not the highest level, but a level that we previously weren't willing to sell, then you run into the issue of, well, the Chinese aren't buying it because she wants his companies to rely on Chinese chips to the extent possible. I saw an interesting chart the other day that showed Chinese are still behind the US, but what you're seeing is the technology gap is closing as time goes on. And so it is a real risk, Catherine. I mean, the one thing
Mm,
you don't hear about it anymore because we're past 2025, but they always talk about made in 2025. Well, they're making them.
yeah. Stephen, just briefly, when we think about AI, we've been talking about AI. Obviously, we need data centers. You've mentioned in your reports that data centers have really gone from this economic focus to being a bit of a political hot point, flashpoint. Explain that to us, and where do we go from here?
Sure. So, the long pole in the tent, right, is the compute capacity right now. So you see all the focus on building the push to build the data centers. And the long pole in building the data centers is the access to energy. So, what you're seeing, the traditional thought in American politics is, uh, how goes the gas prices at the pump will determine how goes the party in power. But well, obviously, in light of the Iran conflict, gas prices are back, and vogue is a concern. But prior to that, what you were hearing a lot about were not prices at the pump, but your utility bill and your electric, how much your electricity was costing. And a lot of that blame is being put on the data centers. There's no doubt the data centers play a role in it. But to be honest, when you dig into the data, a lot of it is also just driven by upgrades to the grid that have been overdue for so long and the capex required for that. But nevertheless, the demand
Yeah.
side, data centers are putting it through the roof. So you hear talk, at least at the local level, or in Maine, there was a bill, even though the governor vetoed it, about
Yeah.
a strict moratorium. My point was always, look, you had three data centers in Maine. You're not talking about Virginia, Texas, or Florida putting in place, or California putting in place a moratorium. But I think the media will always focus on the moratorium on the fringe and overplay that factor. I think the bigger issue is, it's going to take longer to get these through because there's more political pushback. So the data center, developers need to spend
Yeah.
a lot more time investing, educating, lobbying, et cetera. But two, you're going to see at the state, local level, federal level, less incentives put in place. They're not going to provide the tax credits, or there a lot of these things that have been provided are probably going to be rolled back because the onus is going to be put on the data centers. The real big issue here, though, Catherine, is when we talk about the energy supply. The one that in the US they're focused on is what's known as co-location. Co-location means to put an energy source right next to the data center that can support the data center itself, obviously connected to the grid too. But the idea is so that the data center is not drawing so much power from the grid. The issue with this is there's really no policy in place on how to do it. And
Mhm.
our regulators like FERC are working on this. So I think once they develop this policy, that could help provide some guidelines on how to power these things moving forward.
Because all of this translates into the CapEx that these tech companies are spending, the demand for chips, the valuations of some of these stocks, let alone the private equity companies. So there really are a ton of ripple effects. I wonder, though, how much will really be driven by what we were just discussing, right? Which is this political pushback on building new data centers.
Well, it's
Are they going to
also a
push through?
question. Well, I think they are going to push through, but the other question is, Catherine, with technology development, and this is beyond my policy realm, but I talk to enough investors who raise these questions. Are data centers going to be all the rage in 5, 10, 15 years? Or are we going to have compute capacity on what's known as the edge, where you don't need the data centers as much as we're talking about? And if you want like a historical analogy, think about all the money that went into developing the carbon fiber telephone lines in the late 90s, and then cellular came along.
Right. Right. And the analogy to this might be orbital data centers,
Yeah,
which
it's being talked about.
Elon Musk is pursuing. Stephen, we don't have any more time, but of course, next time you come on, we'll talk about where all this leaves us for the midterm elections. Great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.